2 months after Sarah started working at Blackwood Ranch, the first real test of their partnership came in the form of a late spring storm that threatened to destroy everything Marcus had worked to build. The weather had been unusually warm for May, and Sarah had grown accustomed to working in shirt sleeves and enjoying the longer daylight hours. But Marcus had been watching the sky with increasing concern, checking weather reports obsessively, and making preparations that seemed excessive to Sarah's inexperienced eye. "Storm's coming," he announced one Tuesday morning, his face grim. "Big one. Could hit tonight or tomorrow." Sarah looked up at the partly cloudy sky, confused. "It doesn't look that bad. You learn to read the signs out here," Marcus said, already moving toward the barn with purposeful strides. "We need to secure everything that can blow away and get the animals to shelter." For the next 12 hours, they worked with an intensity that Sarah had never experienced. They moved tools and equipment into the barn, reinforced loose boards, and checked every fence post for stability. Marcus showed her how to prepare emergency feed supplies and ensure all the water systems were functioning properly. As the afternoon wore on, the wind began to pick up, and dark clouds gathered on the horizon like an advancing army. Sarah felt her first real flutter of concern when she saw Marcus loading sandbags into his truck. "How bad is this going to be?" she asked. Marcus paused in his work, studying the approaching storm front. "Bad enough. Question is whether we're ready for it." The storm hit just after midnight with a fury that Sarah had never imagined possible. Wind howled around the ranch house like a living thing, rattling windows and sending debris flying through the darkness. Rain came down in sheets so thick that visibility dropped to almost zero. Sarah had been staying in the small apartment above the equipment shed for the past month, an arrangement that had developed naturally as her hours extended and the commute became impractical. Now she was grateful to be close to the animals and the main barn. Around 2 in the morning, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold. The sharp crack of splintering wood followed by panicked animal cries. Without thinking, she pulled on her boots and rain jacket and ran through the storm toward the barn. She found Marcus already there, shouting to be heard over the wind. Part of the barn roof had blown off, and rain was pouring in on the frightened horses. One of the stalls had been damaged, and a young stallion was loose, wild with fear and dangerous in the confined space. "We need to move them to the equipment shed," Marcus yelled, but the stallion reared between them and the other horses, its hooves flashing in the dim light. Sarah acted on instinct, moving slowly toward the panicked animal while speaking in the gentle, soothing voice she'd learned from watching Marcus work. The stallion's ears flicked toward her, and for a moment she thought he might calm down. Then lightning flashed directly overhead, followed immediately by a crash of thunder that seemed to shake the earth. The stallion bolted toward the open barn doors and the storm beyond. Without hesitation, Sarah ran after him into the night. The next few hours blurred together in a nightmare of wind, rain, and desperate effort. Sarah and Marcus worked together to guide the terrified horses to safety, repair emergency shelters, and secure loose equipment that had become dangerous projectiles in the fierce wind. Sarah discovered reserves of strength and determination she hadn't known she possessed. When Marcus needed her to hold a beam steady while he nailed down a temporary roof patch, she held it despite the wind trying to tear it from her hands. When frightened cattle needed to be moved to higher ground as water began to pool in the lower pastures, she waded through the muddy chaos without complaint. They finally found the escaped stallion huddled against a fence line nearly a mile from the barn, cold and exhausted but uninjured. Sarah approached him carefully, speaking softly while Marcus worked to fashion a makeshift halter from rope. "Easy, Thunder," she murmured, recognizing the horse as one she'd been working with for weeks. "We're going to get you somewhere warm and dry." To her amazement, the stallion allowed her to approach and even seemed to take comfort from her presence. Marcus watched with something like admiration as she calmed the animal enough for them to lead him back to safety. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape that looked like a war zone. Trees were down across the access road, debris was scattered everywhere, and several buildings had sustained significant damage. But all the animals were safe, and The main house had weathered the storm intact. Sarah and Marcus stood in the muddy barnyard, exhausted and soaked to the skin, surveying the damage. Sarah felt like she'd been through a battle, but there was something exhilarating about having survived it. "You did good out there," Marcus said quietly. "Real good." Coming from him, the praise meant everything. Sarah realized that somewhere during that long, difficult night, something had fundamentally changed. She wasn't just an employee anymore. She was Marcus's partner in caring for this place and these animals. The weeks that followed the storm were busy with repairs and recovery, but they were also some of the most satisfying of Sarah's life. She and Marcus worked side by side to rebuild what had been damaged, and in the process, she learned skills she'd never imagined needing: basic carpentry, electrical repair, and the kind of problem-solving that came from making do with limited resources. More importantly, the crisis had broken down the last barriers between them. Marcus began to share more stories about the ranch's history, his dreams for its future, and his growing concerns about the financial pressures that threatened its survival. "Insurance will cover some of the storm damage," he explained one evening as they sat on the porch reviewing repair estimates. "But not enough. And the bank's been making noises about wanting to reassess the loan terms." Sarah felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "What does that mean?" "Means they might call the loan. Force me to sell." The thought of losing the ranch, and, by extension, losing the life she was building there, filled Sarah with unexpected panic. "There has to be something we can do." Marcus looked at her with surprise. "We?" Sarah blushed, realizing how presumptuous she must sound. "I'm sorry. I just meant dash. No, don't apologize." Marcus's voice was soft. "I like hearing you say we. Been a long time since I had a partner in anything." That night, Sarah lay awake thinking about the future. She'd been at the ranch for 3 months, and it had become more than just a job. It was home in a way that nowhere else had ever been. She loved the rhythm of ranch life, the satisfaction of caring for animals, and the sense of purpose that came from doing work that truly mattered. But, more than that, she'd grown to care deeply about Marcus himself. Beneath his gruff exterior was a man of deep integrity, unexpected gentleness, and quiet strength. He'd been hurt by loss and hardened by isolation, but Sarah had seen glimpses of who he could be when he allowed himself to trust. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Sarah was mucking stalls when a sleek sedan pulled up to the ranch house, looking completely out of place in the rural setting. A man in an expensive suit emerged, followed by a woman with a tablet and a measuring attitude that made Sarah's skin crawl. Marcus's face went hard when he saw them. "Stay in the barn," he told Sarah quietly. "This won't take long." But Sarah couldn't help overhearing the conversation that followed. The visitors were developers, offering to buy the ranch for far more than it was worth as agricultural land. They spoke about vacation homes and golf courses, about the area's potential for luxury development. "Think about it, Mr. Blackwood," the man was saying. "You could pay off all your debts and still have enough money to retire comfortably. Start fresh somewhere else." "This is my fresh start," Marcus replied coldly. "Has been for 40 years. After the developers left, Marcus was quieter than usual for the rest of the day. That evening, Sarah found him sitting by the small pond behind the house, throwing stones into the water with unusual force. "They'll be back," he said without looking at her. Sarah sat beside him on the weathered log that served as a bench. "Good. Next time you can tell them no even more firmly." Marcus turned to study her face in the fading light. "You really mean that? You'd rather stay here working for barely above minimum wage than see this place turned into some rich man's playground?" "This place matters," Sarah said simply. "The animals matter. The land matters." And she hesitated, then found her courage. "You matter." Something shifted in Marcus's expression, a softening that made him look younger and more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. "Sarah, I need you to know something. These past few months, working with you, it's been—" He struggled for words. "It's been the best I've felt since Mary died." Sarah's heart began to race. They'd been dancing around something unnamed for weeks, an undercurrent of connection that went beyond their working relationship. But neither had dared to acknowledge it directly. "For me too," she whispered. When Marcus reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. His fingers were rough from years of hard work, but his touch was gentle. "I'm not an easy man to care about," he said quietly. I've got more baggage than most. And this ranch demands everything from the people who live here. I know, Sarah replied. But I also know that I've never felt more like myself than I do here with you. The kiss that followed was soft and tentative, a question rather than a demand. But when Sarah kissed him back, it carried all the certainty she felt about the choice she was making. Later that night, as they walked back to the house together, Marcus asked, "What about all those things you wanted? The life you thought you were missing?" Sarah looked around at the ranch spread out under the star-filled sky, at the animals settling down for the night, at the man whose quiet strength had become the foundation of her new world. "I found it," she said. "I just didn't know what I was looking for until I got here." 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same spot where she'd first seen Marcus Blackwood emerge from his house. But everything had changed. The ranch was thriving under their joint management. The storm damage had been fully repaired with improvements that made the buildings stronger than before, and they'd found creative ways to increase revenue that kept the bank satisfied. More importantly, Sarah had found the life she'd been missing, not in some distant city or glamorous career, but right here in the place she'd least expected to find happiness. She discovered that home wasn't a location, but a feeling, and that feeling came from being exactly where you belonged, with exactly the right person, doing work that mattered. The town had gradually accepted their relationship, though some people still whispered about the unlikely pair. Sarah didn't care. She'd learned that other people's opinions mattered far less than the quiet satisfaction that came from building something real and lasting with someone who understood your heart. As she watched Marcus work with a new calf in the morning light, she smiled to herself. She'd come to Blackwood Ranch desperate for any job that would pay the bills. Instead, she'd found her calling, her home, and the love of her life. Sometimes the best things in life came disguised as the scariest opportunities. Sometimes the person everyone warned you about turned out to be exactly the person you needed. And sometimes the life you'd been missing was waiting in the last place you thought to look. 3 weeks into working at Blackwood Ranch, Sarah had developed a routine that felt more natural than anything she'd done in years. She arrived each morning as the first light touched the horizon, finding comfort in the quiet sounds of animals stirring and the fresh smell of hay and leather. Marcus remained distant but fair, and Sarah began to appreciate his straightforward approach to work. He never asked personal questions or made small talk, but he also never criticized her unnecessarily or lost his temper when she made mistakes. In fact, she was starting to suspect that the stories about his violent temper might be greatly exaggerated. The work itself was transforming her in ways she hadn't expected. Her soft hands had grown calloused, but strong. Her body had adapted to the physical demands, and she found herself sleeping better than she had in months. More importantly, she felt useful in a way that her previous jobs had never provided. Everything changed on a Thursday morning when Sarah arrived to find Marcus crouched beside a newborn calf, his face creased with worry. The little animal was weak and struggling to stand, while its mother lowed anxiously nearby. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, setting down her thermos and approaching carefully. "Born too early. Probably won't make it through the day." Marcus's voice was flat, but Sarah caught the underlying sadness. Without thinking, Sarah knelt beside him. "What can we do?" Marcus looked surprised that she'd asked. For a moment, his careful mask slipped, and she saw genuine emotion in his pale green eyes. "Not much. Sometimes nature makes decisions for us." But Sarah wasn't ready to give up. "My grandfather raised cattle. He used to say that sometimes the smallest ones fight the hardest if you give them a chance." Marcus studied her face, as if trying to determine whether she was serious. "Your grandfather know anything about hand-feeding calves every 2 hours?" "I'm a quick learner." For the next several hours, Sarah and Marcus worked together to keep the calf alive. They moved it to a warm stall, rigged up a makeshift feeding system, and took turns monitoring its breathing. Marcus showed her how to mix the special formula and how to encourage the calf to drink. During one of their feeding sessions, as Sarah gently coaxed the calf to take milk from a bottle, Marcus spoke more than she'd heard him speak in 3 weeks combined. "Had a dog once that was born too small. Run of the litter. Everyone said to put it down, that it would never survive." He paused, watching Sarah's patient movements. "That dog lived 15 years, and was the best cattle dog I ever had. Sarah smiled. What was its name? Scout. Marcus's voice softened. She died 2 years ago. Old age. It was the first personal thing Marcus had shared with her, and Sarah felt like she'd been given a small gift. She was beginning to understand that his silence wasn't rudeness or intimidation, it was protection. He was a man who had learned to guard his heart carefully. The calf survived its first day, then its second. By the end of the week, it was standing on wobbly legs and beginning to show signs of the stubborn strength that would help it thrive. Sarah felt ridiculously proud of their success, and she caught Marcus smiling while watching the calf explore its stall. Their working relationship began to shift after that. Marcus started explaining not just what needed to be done, but why. He taught her to read the signs that indicated weather changes, how to spot illness in animals before it became serious, and the complex rhythms that governed ranch life. Sarah discovered that Marcus was incredibly knowledgeable about everything from veterinary care to equipment repair. He could fix almost anything with basic tools and ingenuity, and he had an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that came from years of patient observation. More surprisingly, she learned that many of the stories about his temper were based on misunderstandings. Marcus didn't suffer fools gladly, and he had little patience for laziness or carelessness. But his standards were high because he genuinely cared about doing things right, not because he enjoyed intimidating people. The truth about Marcus Blackwood was far more complex than the town rumors suggested. He was lonely, certainly, and guarded to an almost painful degree. But he was also intelligent, capable, and deeply committed to caring for his animals and his land. Sarah began to look forward to their brief conversations during lunch breaks. Marcus would share stories about the ranch's history, how his grandfather had built it from nothing, how his father had expanded it during good years, and how Marcus had struggled to keep it running after inheriting it along with substantial debts. Bank would love to foreclose, he admitted one afternoon while they repaired fence posts. Land's worth more for development than ranching these days. Is that why you work alone? Sarah asked. To save money on hired help. Marcus was quiet for so long that she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, partly. Also easier than dealing with people who don't understand what this place means. Sarah was beginning to understand. The ranch wasn't just Marcus's livelihood. It was his identity, his connection to his family's legacy, and his refuge from a world that had never quite known what to make of him. One evening, as they finished the day's work, Marcus surprised her by asking, "You planning to stick around, or is this just temporary until something better comes along?" The question caught Sarah off guard. She'd been so focused on day-to-day survival that she hadn't really thought about the future. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "Why?" "Because if you're staying, there's more I could teach you. Real ranch management, not just the basic work." Sarah felt something flutter in her chest, excitement mixed with uncertainty. "You'd want to do that?" Marcus shrugged, but his eyes held a warmth she was starting to recognize. "You're good with the animals. You work hard, and you don't quit when things get difficult." That weekend, Sarah found herself thinking seriously about Marcus's offer. For the first time since her parents' death, someone was suggesting that she might have a future doing something meaningful. The idea both thrilled and terrified her. On Sunday, she drove out to the ranch even though she didn't have to work. She told herself she just wanted to check on the calf they'd saved, but really she wanted to see the place when it was quiet, to understand why Marcus found such peace there. She found him sitting on his porch, drinking coffee, and watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. He didn't seem surprised to see her. "Couldn't stay away?" he asked, and there was something almost like amusement in his voice. "Just wanted to check on the animals," Sarah said, though they both knew it was a half-truth. Marcus nodded toward the empty chair beside him. "Coffee's still warm if you want some." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last light fade from the sky. Sarah felt more relaxed than she had in months, maybe years. There was something about the ranch that made her feel like she could breathe again. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said finally. "Why did your wife really die?" Marcus went very still beside her. For a moment, Sarah worried she'd pushed too far, crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. When he spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Cancer. Took 2 years to kill her." He paused, then added quietly, "I stayed with her every day in the hospital at the end. People saw me leaving looking angry and upset, and they made up their own stories about why. Sarah felt a wave of sadness wash over her, not just for Marcus's loss, but for the way grief had been twisted into something sinister by people who didn't understand. "I'm sorry," she said simply. Marcus nodded. "Town needs someone to be afraid of, I guess. Easier to think I'm dangerous than to admit that sometimes bad things just happen to good people." In that moment, Sarah understood something important about Marcus Blackwood. He wasn't the fearsome figure people made him out to be. He was just a man who had loved his wife deeply, lost her too soon, and learned to live with a grief that had no outlet except hard work and solitude. As she drove home that night, Sarah realized that something fundamental had shifted in how she saw not just Marcus, but her own life. For years, she'd felt like she was drifting, waiting for real life to begin. But, sitting on that porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, she'd felt more like herself than she had since she was a child. Maybe the life she'd been missing wasn't somewhere else, waiting to be found. Maybe it was right here, in a place she'd never thought to look. Sarah Martinez clutched the crumpled newspaper clipping in her sweaty palm as she stood outside the rusted gate of Blackwood Ranch. The help wanted ad was barely 3 lines long, offering work to anyone willing to handle livestock and ranch duties. No experience required, it said, but Sarah wondered if that was because no experienced hand would dare work for Marcus Blackwood. The stories about him spread through their small Texas town like wildfire through dry grass. People whispered that he'd driven off every ranch hand within a month, that his temper could turn violent without warning, and that his late wife had died under mysterious circumstances. The grocery store clerks fell silent when he walked in, and even the boldest men in town avoided eye contact with the tall, weathered rancher. Sarah had heard all the rumors, but she also heard the growling of her empty stomach and felt the weight of unpaid bills stuffed into her kitchen drawer. At 26, she'd already worked 3 different jobs in the past year, each one ending when the local businesses struggled to stay afloat. Her apartment rent was 2 months overdue, and her car had been making concerning noises that she couldn't afford to fix. The gate creaked as she pushed it open, and her boots crunched on the gravel driveway leading to a sprawling ranch house that had seen better days. Paint peeled from the wooden shutters, and weeds grew wild around the porch steps. The place felt abandoned despite the obvious signs of life: fresh tire tracks in the dirt, smoke curling from the chimney, and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the fields. Marcus Blackwood appeared on the porch before she could knock. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she took in his imposing figure. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders that filled out his worn flannel shirt, and dark hair streaked with premature gray. His face was all sharp angles and hard lines, weathered by years of sun and wind. But it was his eyes that made her step back involuntarily, pale green and cold as winter frost. "You hear about the job?" His voice was rough, like he didn't use it often for pleasant conversation. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Up close, Marcus Blackwood looked exactly like the kind of man who could make grown men nervous and send women hurrying to the other side of the street. "Can you handle hard work?" he asked, studying her with those unsettling eyes. "Yes, sir." The words came out steadier than she felt. "Animals don't scare you?" "No, sir." He was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah felt like he was seeing right through her desperation to the fear she was trying to hide. Finally, he jerked his head toward the barn. "Come on. Let's see what you're made of." The tour of Blackwood Ranch revealed a property that was both impressive and neglected. Hundreds of acres stretched out toward the horizon, dotted with cattle and crossed by weathered fencing that needed repair. The barn was massive but showing its age, with loose boards and a roof that clearly leaked in several places. Equipment sat rusting in the yard, and the whole place had the air of a once thriving operation that was slowly falling apart. Marcus explained the job in his clipped, no-nonsense way. She'd be responsible for feeding the animals, mucking stalls, mending fences, and whatever else needed doing around the ranch. The pay was fair, better than fair, actually, which made Sarah wonder why he was having trouble keeping help. "I work alone," he said as they walked back toward the house. "Always have. Don't need someone chattering all day or asking fool questions every 5 minutes." Sarah nodded, though she wondered how lonely it must be to live and work in such isolation. One more thing. Marcus stopped and turned to face her, his expression serious. People in town will try to fill your head with stories about me. Some true, some not. I don't care what you believe, but I won't tolerate gossip or drama on my property. You do your work, I'll pay you fair, and we'll get along fine. The warning sent a chill down Sarah's spine, but she needed this job too badly to let fear win. She shook his outstretched hand, surprised by the gentleness of his grip despite his calloused palms. When do I start? Tomorrow. Dawn. That evening, Sarah sat in her nearly empty apartment, wondering what she'd gotten herself into. Her best friend Lisa called to check on her job search, and when Sarah mentioned Blackwood Ranch, the line went silent. Sarah, no? You can't be serious. The pay is good, Lisa. Really good. Money isn't worth your safety. My cousin Jake worked there 2 years ago and said Blackwood threatened him with a shotgun over some minor mistake. Sarah rubbed her temples. I need this job. I'm behind on rent, my car's about to die, and I've got bills I can't pay. There has to be something else. What about the diner downtown? They're not hiring. Nobody is. Sarah's voice cracked with frustration. I'm 26 years old, Lisa. I should be able to take care of myself. But I feel like I'm drowning. After they hung up, Sarah stood at her apartment window looking out at the lights of the town. She'd lived here her whole life, but lately it felt like the place was suffocating her. Every street corner held memories of dreams that hadn't worked out, relationships that had failed, and opportunities that had slipped through her fingers. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 19, leaving her to figure out adulthood on her own. She tried community college, but couldn't afford to finish. She dated a few local men, but nothing had lasted. Most of them seemed content to spend their lives in the same small town, doing the same jobs their fathers had done, never wanting anything more. But Sarah wanted more. She just didn't know what that more looked like or how to get it. Her first morning at Blackwood Ranch began before sunrise. Sarah arrived to find Marcus already at work in the barn, moving with quiet efficiency as he checked on the horses. He acknowledged her arrival with a nod and handed her a pitchfork. Stalls need mucking. Start with the mare in the corner. She's gentle. The work was harder than Sarah had expected. By noon, her back ached, and her hands were blistered despite the work gloves Marcus had provided. But there was something satisfying about the physical labor, about seeing immediate results from her efforts. Marcus worked alongside her, but rarely spoke. When he did, it was always about the task at hand, which feed to use for which animals, how to properly repair a fence post, the signs that indicated a cow might be getting sick. His instructions were clear and patient, though his manner remained distant. During lunch break, Sarah sat on the porch steps eating the sandwich she'd packed, watching Marcus tend to a horse that seemed to be favoring one leg. His hands were gentle as he examined the animal's hoof, and his voice took on a soft, soothing tone that was completely different from his usual gruff manner. Easy, girl. Let me see what's bothering you. The horse, a beautiful chestnut mare with white markings, seemed to trust him completely. She stood still while he worked, occasionally nuzzling his shoulder affectionately. Sarah found herself staring, fascinated by this glimpse of a different side of Marcus Blackwood. The man everyone feared was being incredibly gentle with an injured animal, showing a patience and kindness that contradicted everything she'd heard about him. When Marcus noticed her watching, his expression hardened again, and he turned away to lead the mare to a different stall. The rest of the day passed in similar fashion, hard work punctuated by brief moments that hinted at hidden depths beneath Marcus's intimidating exterior. Sarah began to notice things. The way he made sure every animal had fresh water before he took a drink himself, how he unconsciously hummed while he worked, and the careful way he maintained his equipment despite its age. As the sun began to set, Marcus handed her an envelope containing her first day's wages. You did good work today, he said simply. It was the closest thing to praise Sarah had received in months, and she felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. Marcus is fine. He paused, then added, be here same time tomorrow. Driving home in her rattling car, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time. Hope. The work was challenging, and Her new boss was certainly intimidating, but for the first time in months, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. That night, she fell asleep without worrying about bills or her uncertain future. Instead, she found herself thinking about the way Marcus had cared for the injured horse and wondering what other surprises Blackwood Ranch might hold.